Ha ha ha!
It's been a while since I've done Eureka. All right, so
We're good? We're on? We're live? It's hip, it's happening, it's everything. All right, let's pray. Father, help us to breathe deep after a little technological fun there. We're glad that everything is up and ready to roll. It has been a really interesting week or so when it comes to issues of social justice. And be with us as we talk about biblical justice and social justice, the differences between them. Help me to be clear, and you to be honored in the midst of this. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, most of you probably can't remember. We did do part one of this book. I'm basing a lot of this stuff. I guess the pro-presenter no-go. If it doesn't go, it's fine. It's not the end of the universe.
projector's on twice.
I just spent, 3 hours doing it.
As you can see, the pro presenter is not sending anything to the but the stream is working.
Okay, we'll just roll with it. They can see me. It's okay. Let's summarize what we talked about before. And the way that Thaddeus Williams lays out his book is in a series of 12 questions. 3 each have a different main idea that ties them together. And he starts off, though, with a foreword by John Perkins, who talks about how social justice properly understood, okay, what Thaddeus is going to call social justice A, begins with God, begins with the gospel, and is trying to be a biblical in its approach to the realities of justice, reflecting the reality that God calls for justice as in addition to personal righteousness. So in addition to personal morality, there's also the idea of justice that is found throughout the scriptures, and we need to be faithful to that. But there's also this thing that he calls social justice B, which is what most people mean when they talk about social justice. And that is a secular, generally, understanding of social justice, although some people try to Christianize it. And so he's drawing out the distinctions between these two things. And so our little summary on session 1 is that while social justice A recognizes God as sovereign and the person who defines justice and injustice, social justice B erases the creator-creature distinction and embraces the false gods of self, state, and social acceptance. And so that's pretty clear, I think. Clear distinction. Number 2, while social justice A recognizes unity in our shared guilt in Adam, Christians are united in our new identity in Christ, regardless of our tribe, tongue, and nation. And it focuses on a reconciliation through the gospel. Social justice B, on the other hand, breaks people up into identity groups and pits them against one another for a new form of tribal warfare. Essentially, kind of what it does. Third, while social justice A offers us the fruit of the Spirit, which unites people in love, peace, patience, kindness, etc., social justice B generates a spirit of mutual suspicion, hostility, fear, labeling, and resentment. Fourthly, from the previous one, and if it's still online if you want to go look at it, and if you weren't here before, while social justice A champions a love that is not easily offended, social justice B encourages people to quickly take offense. Okay. Oh, we're getting there. All right. Why don't we go down till we get to a summary of of session 1. So I should have broken this up into a separate PowerPoint. I failed. Because like every time I do a new PowerPoint thing, it just drives me crazy. Me and technology, you have issues sometimes. It's not wanting to respond to you, huh? Oh. Yeah, summary continued. Oh. Okay. Should be slide 16 or 17, I think. Maybe not. Oh, okay. Keep going. That's session 1. Okay, what's next? Because that's the end of a section. Okay. Oh, wow. Keep going. The unity one should have been, wow, the second one. Well, he looks for that. I will keep going. Oh, there it is. Really? What's, huh. All right. Most of it was bigger font. All right, let's see, where was I? Ah, yes. While social justice A recognizes that we are sinners individually, we also create sinful systems. So both need to be addressed properly by getting at the root with the gospel. Social justice B blames oppression on systems such that all disparity is therefore evidence of discrimination and must be resolved with activism, not faith or repentance. For instance, I will pause for a second. Someone who's in the audience shared a collection of the responses to the passing of the Florida law. And I watched part of it, I didn't watch all of it, but someone was like, I'm going to be a good activist. And I mean, that's the mindset. It's not, this law has a good reason for its existence. One, they're misrepresenting the law. And secondly, I don't know why they feel hell-bent, and really hell-bent on teaching these things to people who are in kindergarten, for the love of Pete. It's all about activism. The Florida law, which prohibits the teaching of sexuality to children under, is it 5th grade? Third grade. Okay. It has been falsely called the Don't Say Gay law by the activists. And that's not what it's about. It's about the fact that kindergartners don't need to know all of this stuff. And they don't need to know that you have weird pronouns and things. That can happen later. I mean, does the child really need to, they should just call you your last name or something. Anyway, I don't want to get off tangent too much. Sixthly, while social justice A upholds universal guilt in Adam, which can only be addressed in Christ, and condemns people for sin rather than for their ethnicity, gender, or class. Social justice B, on the other hand, imputes guilt based on one's skin color, group identity, which is resolved only by the renouncing of privilege and the joining the mission to end oppression under the authority of the oppressed. And so what you're supposed to do is renounce your privilege, become an ally, but they're in charge. You just do what they tell you to do. And maybe they'll like you. So that was the first 6 the summaries of the first 6 questions that came up. So part 3, because remember there are 4 main sections, each of them has 3 questions. So part 3 has really the idea of sinners or systems. Okay, are we concerned mostly with the individual and what they do, or are we concerned mostly with systems? Okay, now behind all of this, of course, is are we going to follow a biblical understanding of man and sin, or are we going to follow Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that philosopher that some of you may have heard his name? I've mentioned him in sermons. His philosophy, which was taken up by a number of people, including the Marxists, is man is good, okay, until the institutions, particularly the church, the educational system, government, corrupt them. That corruption, evil, comes not from the individual, but from the system. And the system corrupts a person. So the individual might do something wrong, but it's the system's fault. It's it's the school system, or it's the bad stuff they learned at church, that sort of thing. And so these differences end up leading to very different understandings of salvation. One is in Christ, and the other one is through activism, but activism that is moving towards essentially an overthrow of the oppressors, the oppressive institutions, a tearing down of the institutions. And so when someone says to me that CRT, critical race theory, is okay, I go, well, do you understand what the end game is here? Do you understand that what they want to do is tear down all the systems? To remove the Constitution in our country, but the constitutions of other countries, they want to not just put different people in office, but change government completely. They want to put a whole new system in. It's not simply, he's a bad racist, let's vote him out. That's not what they're trying to accomplish. Okay. But we also recognize in a biblical understanding of people, humanity, and sin, things like this from Psalm 94. Can wicked rulers be allied with you, those who frame injustice by statute? They band together against the life of the righteous and condemn the innocent to death. So that's verse 20 and 21 of Psalm 94. And the point being, wicked rulers make, what do you think? Wicked laws. Okay? Wicked systems. And so there is such a reality as systematic injustice, or systemic injustice, rather. But it's because the people who are making the laws are unjust themselves. They are evil. It's not because of the color of their skin or of their gender. Okay? Even though some of the laws may be racist. Right? Because the people making the laws are racist. One of the big things that's pointed out too often is, or is said anyway, the U.S. Constitution is racist. Has anyone heard someone say that? Okay, I'm surprised. Not all of you have heard that. Okay, well, it had a racist part of it. Anyone know what I would be shooting at? The 3/5 compromise. See, you didn't grow up, you went to Canadian school, so you don't know this. Well, when it was initially formed, they had this question of how will the population be counted for representation in Congress? Okay? Because in the North, They didn't have slaves. In the South, they do. And so the South wanted to have a higher population so they would have more representatives in Congress, okay, in the House of Representatives, because that's based on population. The North said, wait a minute, you've got these people who can't vote. Why are you counting them? And so what ended up happening is they would do a census of the slaves, but then say, okay, 3/5 of that number is added to the population such that now you know the number of representatives. So it was a racist thing because a black person counted as 3/5 of a person. All right? That was wrong. Do we still do that? No. And so one of the problems is there's not a recognition of things that have actually changed. And so that element is gone, and that should be noted, okay? Another illustration of a different kind, this is not about racism, so to speak, but we once had someone come before Presbytery. They had their exceptions to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and one of the exceptions they brought up was that says, I don't believe that the Pope is the Antichrist. Well, that was in the original Westminster Confession of Faith, but it is not in the version of the Westminster Confession of Faith that we currently use. That has been edited out, okay? And so the point is invalid. You're not taking an exception to the standards as we hold them. You're taking exception to something that is, 400 years old, and we're not using that, okay?
When was it changed? Remember when it was changed?
No, I don't.
Okay, I just curious.
No,
You said 400 years old, and I just curious.
I don't know. And the same thing as we don't. There's nothing about the king. We have an Americanized version that recognizes just the civil magistrate, not the king. So, anyway, so Scripture does warn about wicked rulers that make wicked laws. This is how we can understand that idea of systemic injustice. This is not what, or not precisely what, social justice means by systemic injustice. They think the whole thing has been tainted and destroyed and is therefore racist. Okay? Because it was made by racists. So it's not just one part of it in their view, the 3/5 compromise that's racist, the whole rest of it is racist because it's put together by those white imperialists from Europe. Okay? So, all right. I feel like I've talked too much. Before we move to question 7, which is the first question in this series, Sinners or Systems, do you have any questions? Is there anything I said that wasn't clear, or? Yeah, you do, and that's one of the problems with his philosophy. I have not read him extensively, but I'm not aware of any explanation that is offered. Whenever I've come across this. Well, because they won't be Christian. He hated the church. And he thought that the church was the source of so much of the evil in the world. So you get rid of the church, and you get rid of the morality of the church and all those things, and you'll have a nice, really cool society, right? Pretty much. Right. Because I obviously am fully just and righteous. I'm sure Jean-Jacques Rousseau would say he was. So.
I got your slides imported. They're not going through the stream yet. I may figure that out.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. And so, back to Psalm 94, that wicked rulers include those who frame injustice by statute. what they often do is they band together against the righteous. And, they condemn the wicked to death. So, huh? Oh, sorry, yeah, the innocent to death. So, if we can slide to the next one, which is gives us question 7. You may or may not get there. He's talking. Does our vision of social justice prefer damning stories to undamning facts? And this gets to, he calls this the disparity question. And the idea is that there's a disparity in information that is permitted to be discussed. Okay? You can discuss the damning stories, but you can't discuss anything that might remove the damnation from the stories. You can't actually explain why something happened. It's irrelevant. Okay, it's just the damning story. So social justice A says that essentially any system that either requires or encourages those within the system to break the moral laws of God revealed for his creatures flourishing is unjust. So injustice is seen as encouraging or mandating someone break God's law. Okay, that's how injustice is defined in a biblical form of social justice. For example, some old examples would be the emperor cults in Babylon and Rome. Okay? We have examples of that in Scripture. We have allusions to it and references to it in Scripture as well. For instance, in Daniel, blew the horn. Everyone was supposed to worship the statue of the emperor, okay? And those who didn't were going to be killed. And so we have Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Abednego. I always say it wrong. I don't know why. I learned it wrong as a child at some point, and I just say it wrong all the time. It's just in my head. So anyway, they were thrown into the fiery furnace and didn't die because God preserved them. But that's an example of an unjust system. They were told to break God's law. They refused to do so. The emperor cults in Rome also were similar, and that's why the Christians in the early church were considered to be atheists. They didn't accept the other gods that everyone else accepted, the Roman and Greek gods, and particularly they did not want to worship the emperor. And when you look at, in particular, the letters to the 7 churches, you see some evidence of this. Okay, so modern examples would be encouraging or mandating abortion. That's wicked. Abortion is wicked, and then mandating it or encouraging it would be wicked as well. And it's unjust to encourage same-sex marriage. That would violate God's law. Okay, Genesis 2. Not charging rioters, for instance. You're allowing people to get away with injustice. Insurrectionists, avoiding, paying attention to these insurrectionists, but ignoring these insurrectionists. Because you like these insurrectionists, but you don't like these insurrectionists, because they voted for the wrong guy. That's unjust. That's unjust. Paying people not to work. Not paying people who can't work, but paying people who refuse to work. Or just telling them, don't work, here's some money. That is unjust. Social justice B says that injustice is revealed by unequal outcomes. Okay, so we have Ibram X. Kendi. I don't think I put his question there, his quote. I forgot about that. When I see racial disparities, I see injustice. Okay, now, does anyone know who Ibram Kendi is? You've heard the name. Does anyone know where he works? Boston University, my alma mater. He is one of the leaders of the anti-racism movement. He's not like some random dude who wrote a letter to the editor of some newspaper in Des Moines, Iowa or something. He's one of the leaders of the movement. He's like the guy, okay? And unfortunately, there was a PCA guy who, because of his PhD, studied all of this, and now he works with IBRAM. He's very discouraging. But racial disparity of some sort obviously must be racism. So some of the examples that are frequently used, for instance, and this can also be used for gender disparities, like the first one. Women make up only 15.67% of tech jobs in Silicon Valley. Sexist. Black drivers receive nearly double the speeding tickets as white drivers on the New Jersey Turnpike. Obviously, hey man, I didn't come up with it. But yes. Mortgage lenders reject twice as many blacks as whites for home loans. Okay, so this is viewed as racism within the lending industry. So when you're working for social justice B, you start with the idea that because systemic injustice is revealed by unequal outcomes, you're looking to spot the unequal outcomes. So you go, oh, look, see the speeding people in New Jersey, okay? You interpret the outcome as evidence of a racist or sexist system, and then you try to overthrow the system that produces the outcome. You don't hold individuals accountable for perhaps having bias. It's the system. Yeah, I'm gonna challenge all of these things, but is your question related? You're fighting for New Jersey, Amy?
No, but I'm reminded of the conversation I had with a friend of mine who's Hispanic, and right, you know what I'm talking about?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
So he's Hispanic. He's very successful.
Oh, yeah, now I know.
And
He makes more money in tips than I make in salary in a year.
it's very true. And
He's
he
like,
was having like dinner with his aunt and uncle, and his uncle was talking about it's just racist. I can't get a mortgage, and that's because of racism. And my friend's response was, or it could be that no one wants to give a 30-year mortgage to a 65-year-old. But that didn't even occur to him.
yeah. See, the damning story. All that mattered was the damning story. I can't get a mortgage, not the facts that explain it. I'm not sure I would want to give a 30-year mortgage to a 65-year-old man, particularly one who hasn't earned a whole lot of money in his life. So, did you also have a question?
What I was going to point out goes back to the original question. We can talk about the daily story, but we can't talk about the undamaged facts, because all examples that you gave, there are other facts that could and probably do explain why those disparities exist.
Indeed, there often are.
And not just because of racism,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, what progressive Christians will sometimes do is add this idea of identity as a gospel issue and call those who disagree with them white supremacists or male chauvinists. And, in a sense, they're very much like the secularist social justice B. That tends to be the response. How dare you bring that up? You're just another one of those white supremacists who don't want Puerto Ricans to get ahead. Okay, that's how it goes. Okay, so let's look at some of these things. when it comes to women making up the percent of tech jobs in Silicon Valley, there is a reality that women, not men, contrary to what some people might say, bear children. And so a lot of women leave the workplace in tech jobs in order to have children, and it's hard to get back because a lot happens really quickly in the tech world. Okay? Some women go back, but some women don't want to go back. And so that explains at least part of the disparity. It doesn't necessarily explain all of it. But when you talk to these tech companies, they're woke, aren't they? Aren't most of those tech companies in Silicon Valley woke? They're real concerned about all this stuff. There's a reason why they stay in California. They believe that if they move to the heartland of this country, that the racism will be so bad that none of the minorities will work for them. That's what they say. And yet, these are the companies that now, in this, are being called racist. It's pretty interesting when you think about it. So anyway, let's get back to New Jersey. They set up cameras on the New Jersey Turnpike to film these things to see what the results would be. And what they discovered is that nearly twice as many black drivers as a percentage were speeding as opposed to white drivers. Now, does this mean that black people drive faster? No. There's another part of this equation that they took into account. They looked at who these people are, and the median age of black drivers was much lower, and therefore, we usually recognize that younger drivers speed more often, and they speed at greater speeds. So do you want to know why? Well, there's more young black drivers than there are white drivers on the New Jersey Turnpike, and they tend to speed more. That's not racist. Okay?
How fast you have to go to get pulled over for speeding on the turnpike.
I know, you have to,
I've driven that before, and
you got to work at it.
yeah.
Yeah, every year I drive on the New Jersey Turnpike, and you got to work at it. But I don't, it's not like I drive by a police car and just go, hey, I'm white. I get to drive fast. And he goes, oh, yeah, man, good, keep going. So, whites who were seeking home loans were actually turned down at a much higher rate than Asian Americans. So you can't say it's white supremacy. You can't say that it's that the white people are racist at the mortgage company unless they're all run by Asian Americans. Okay, so additionally, when you look at black-owned banks, and yes, there are black-owned banks, they also turn down blacks at a higher rate. Why? Well, probably because the percentage of African Americans in poverty is higher than the percentage of whites in America who are in poverty. So, other factual circumstances can often explain disparities much better and more accurately than injustice. I was talking with my daughter last night. She's tackling issues I never even would think of tackling. So she's got an English paper, and I'm like, so what you doing it on? The rise in mortality rates among mothers in America. Like at birth and shortly after the birth of the child. How they've been increasing. But she mentioned 2020. I said, remember, 2020 includes COVID and all the things that changed within the hospitals, but also the reality that there were, COVID was very dangerous for pregnant women. So that explains part of, maybe not all of, the rise in that particular year, but that needs to be factored in. So, get as much information as you can before you jump to the conclusion of obviously racist or sexist. Now we have a quote from me. I think I said this in a sermon at one point. Racism is real, but not all that is called racism is actually racism. Okay? It is a real thing, but some people just jump to conclusions about it. And so Thaddeus Williams, encourages us to do a thought experiment. And that thought experiment includes the characters in Parks and Recreation. Okay? And if you've seen the show, you'll be familiar with the very different characters in the show. But this thought experiment is that imagine we all woke up in a world without injustice, and each of us had $1 million in the bank. Okay? There's no oppressive system. Will the outcomes be equal? Yeah, they wouldn't be. And so, he says, think about the people in Parks and Recreation. And so if you look on the far right hand there, you see that African-American lady. Her name was Donna. And Donna would probably expand her real estate business and make money. Okay? That would be Donna. Ben, on the other hand, who is, I believe he's the guy just to the right there of the main character, he would spend his money building Ice Town. So he's had this project he wants to do for the town, and he would probably build this project. Ron, who is the guy in the mustache, okay, he's the libertarian. He would probably buy gold and bury it on his property. So, or he'd buy a lot of steak and bacon. He liked meat. Tommy, on the other hand, who is the Asian on the far left, Tommy would throw a bunch of red carpet parties with extravagant extras like exotic animals, and his money would probably be gone in about a month and a half, because that is who Ronnie is. Tommy, on the other hand, wait a minute, sorry, that's Tommy. Chris, who's played by Rob Lowe over there on the far right, he literally would invest in a vegan market chain, okay? And he would probably lose money on that, or maybe stay the same. But Andy, who is played by Chris Pratt, kind of over there, by Donna, he would probably buy lots of Skittles and do nothing with his $1 million. He'd waste his $1 million. And so you have to take into account the preferences and personalities and responsibility of each of those people when you consider the outcome if they had $1 million. If each of us was given $1 million, we would, I imagine, do very different things with it. But knowing you, I don't think any of you would go crazy and do anything fundamentally stupid, but you would spend it differently. Some people would invest it. Some would give large chunks of it away. Some might buy a nice big house or maybe a lake house. Might be tempted to buy an island, but they're a little too expensive for $1 million. There are days I want to buy an island and just go away. So anyway, different outcomes, not necessarily connected to racism, because we're dealing with real, huh?
Like the lottery winners.
Right. Some of them do okay. They're wise. They don't quit their jobs. Or they say, well, I can get the job I like. I'm not tied to this job. But some of them quit and buy 3 homes and expensive cars and go on a bunch of vacations, and in 3 years they have nothing left, and they're in Florida filing for bankruptcy because they have kind bankruptcy laws in Florida. So, this is reality. It's not racist. So, they have different outcomes because they have different preferences, different amounts of wisdom, and they will therefore make very different choices. And actually, see here, lottery winners generally go broke. So, do not be deceived, as it says in Galatians 6. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that also will he reap. So, God did design us to fight against the devil's schemes, which include injustice. Our battle isn't about protests. It's not about riots or using the weapons of men, but we seek to slay sin in the hearts of sinners through the gospel. So, wow, I've spent more time on that than I wanted to. So we're actually going to not do the things to talk about, which is the next slide. But do we have any questions? I know, I just set myself up for getting no questions. Don't feel intimidated by that statement. If you actually have a question or a comment, that's okay. Gives me time to sip. George.
Seems like, so it can't go deeper than that, just saying that people all have different motivations, different ideas, different preferences and whatnot. But where did all those differences come from? Their environment, their institutions, things that have to do with other unjust things
Mm-hmm.
that produce these ideas. Someone decided, well, I'm not going to invest my money because it's just run by a bunch of white racists and bankers in Wall Street,
Mm-hmm.
bad cats, so therefore I'm going to do something else.
Or I invested my money in the stock market, and it crashed in 1929. And I tried to get my money out of the bank, and I couldn't. So now I'm going to hide my money in a mattress. Yeah, that's.
Now you're talking about the generation of my parents.
Yeah, I know. And that affects people. So, yeah.
There's also, it goes farther than this, but a child grows up with an alcoholic father and becomes an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
Another child grows up with an alcoholic father and refuses to touch alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Complete opposite.
And they might even be brothers.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. The heart will respond in different ways, even though the circumstances might be nearly identical, because we are different. We have different risk-reward metrics. You know, saw that during COVID. You know, some people thought I was too risky. You know, and maybe I was. You know, I don't know. But I figured as I looked at the data, I'm in reasonably good shape. I'm trying to get exercise, trying to keep my immune system in good shape. I should be all right. But you never know. Something bad might happen. You know, I might get a bad case because I'm prone to bronchitis. But I can't change that. But I also don't want to live in my basement. Well, in part because I don't have a basement, but but you understand. I don't want to live that way.
The
So.
first person that I saw get COVID was at work. They were wearing a mask, a gown, rubber boots, and rubber gloves. That's what convinced me we don't need to go there, or I don't need to go there. Yeah, the different learning experiences.
Yeah.
The direction.
And it's different for everybody. I can't expect everyone to respond to COVID the way I responded to COVID. So, all right, number 8. Does our vision of social justice promote racial strife? Okay, this is really the color question, he calls it. And it's okay to say Black Lives Matter. You can't say all lives matter. I watched a documentary about some Christians who owned a very successful restaurant. I can't remember what city it was in right now. That's okay. And they were Christians, though, and they kept trying to say all lives matter. Well, didn't matter. Their business got destroyed. It might have been Chicago. And they actually had to leave town. They had to move away because they didn't want to say simply Black Lives Matter. Brown lives matter too. Yellow lives, even though that's a horrible thing to actually say. But I mean, that just sounds racist, doesn't it? Or red. White lives matter. All of them matter. Okay? But social justice A values the dignity and flourishing of all people regardless of their skin color, whereas social justice B values the flourishing of particular people and at the expense of others that they view as racist. Okay? What's interesting to me, excuse me, is that many Hispanics, I mean, I go, oh, I would say Hispanics are a minority, right? Not considered that anymore. Not sure why. Even though down here, it certainly seems there is racism against Hispanics by some people, not everybody. Asian Americans, they're not treated like a minority. They're treated as, now they fall into white, the white category, because they're overrepresented in the best paying jobs. So I guess it's really not about the skin color. It's about representation. Are you demographically properly represented where we want you to be properly represented? Obviously not in the NBA, okay, which has very few white players, but in other places, underrepresented. So let's get to a real world problem that kind of hits on this, and this is a very painful one, so be patient with me. Don't get angry, okay? We have seen a number of black men and teens killed by police and citizens. There is frequently, we're going to get to the stats in a little bit. Frequently, there are no consequences for those who pull the trigger. Okay. However, do we know the names of any of the 2,352 white men that were fatally shot by police from January 2015 to July 2020? Any of them? We know Trayvon Martin. We know Michael Brown. We know a lot of names. But we don't know any of the other names. Does that mean their lives don't matter? When we get back to the statistics, what we find is that about 1,000 image bearers per year are shot by police who also happen to be image bearers. About 50% of those victims were white. About 25% of those victims were black. Okay? Now, there is a degree of racial disparity there, because 25% is higher than the percentage of the population. Okay? So there are, percentage-wise, more African Americans shot by police than there are white people compared to the demographics. Okay? Now, that does not necessarily mean racism. It can be racism, and in some cases, it might actually be racism. Okay? There are racist cops. Okay? Unfortunately, they don't walk around with a little R on their chest so you can identify them quickly. Right? When we look at deeper, we realize that about 4% of these people who were killed by police were unarmed. Okay? We tend to act like it's you listen to some of the activists and it sounds like every day there's an unarmed black person who's just shot on the street by these racist cops. That's not what's happening. So of these 4% were unarmed. On average, you had 25 unarmed whites and 18 unarmed African Americans that are shot each year. So again, you have a little bit of disparity or disproportionate numbers, okay? When you look deeper at the numbers, what you find is that all of them, of those people, 25% of the, or 25 of the whites, or all of the whites, and half of the, or just under half of the African Americans were not fleeing the scene. Okay? So, you know, a little over half of the African Americans who were shot were fleeing the scene when they were shot and killed. When you look at those who did not flee the scene, almost all of them were attacking the police officers and were usually under the influence of drugs and or alcohol. So, a little digger deep in some of these statistics. You know, so you'd recognize, hopefully, that racism does play a part in some police shootings, but it is not, does not explain all police shootings, or perhaps even most police shootings. I think is the next one. I think I got something there. Yeah. Violent crimes, like when you attack a police officer or you're trying to harm someone else, are usually met with a violent response. You're more likely to get shot by the police if you try to kill the police. And there is, in fact, a disparity in the commission of violent crimes. In places where there is lower police presence, there are typically more violent crimes. And so that disparity explains many of the other disparities. Not 100%, but a large proportion of them. Okay? Where am I? These things have to be taken into consideration. And when they are taken into consideration, there appears to be little to no racial bias, okay, when we look at police shootings. As I said, this does not exclude racism as a factor, but it just doesn't account for all of them the way the activists want us to think and the way the media wants us to think. Okay? What we find is that there are other sorts of disparities that do have something of a racial bias. Okay? Black Americans are 13.4% of the population, but they make up 34% of the prison population. And you might go, well, you know, there's more violence. Okay. However, drug rates, meaning drug use, are about the same between African Americans and white Americans, but African Americans are 6 times more likely to be imprisoned for drug offenses. Okay. That would indicate some bias. I'll not mention the, well, I will mention this, I guess. Back in 1986, Maryland basketball star Len Bias was drafted by the Boston Celtics, and then he had his little press conference in Boston, and then he flew back home to Maryland, and later that night, he died of a cocaine overdose. Okay. Because he was such a high-profile person, the congressmen were obviously upset. And so you have what's called the Len Bias Law, which has stricter penalties for those who provide drugs to other people. And that is one of the laws that has resulted in such high imprisonment. There's a particular guy who's president right now who was one of the guys leading that charge. So, but I mean, I don't think he did it because he was racist, but that's what, well, I don't think he did it because he's racist. But the result of it was a racial inequality I'm not, it may be an unintended consequences in how it was applied, but that would be not just the police, that's the courts, that's the legal system. There's all different places where the process can get corrupted to have this really lousy outcome that is unjust and unfair. So, I am for some measures of prison reform. Not the cash bail system, but that's me. That's me. The absence of the black father is also a big part of this cycle. It's still 2.5 times more likely to be, an African American is 2.5 times more likely to be born out of wedlock than another child of a different ethnic background. There's a neglect of what is often called the success syndrome. In order. Okay, you want to do okay in life? Well, this is what you do. You finish your education. Then you get and keep a full-time job. This sounds really hard. Then you get married. And then you have the kids. In that order. And you stay married. Yeah. For instance, when you look at the black poverty rate, it's 22%. Is that the next slide? Yep, there it is. Okay. The white poverty rate is 11%. There's some disparity there, my friends. Okay? But a lot of it has to do with, as we'll see, the poverty rate for married black couples is only 7.5%. So black families that stay together and are able to maintain jobs, they aren't impoverished, or they're impoverished far less than those who don't. They're able to build some capital, perhaps possibly buy a home, which is actually one of the main things of wealth in America, home ownership. Okay, these are people who are, marriage matters when it comes to poverty. Social justice B, on the other hand, says that it claims that it's nearly impossible for African Americans to escape poverty. So how in the world did 92.5% of them stay out of poverty? If it's impossible, there's other factors that are involved besides being black. Much of one of the interesting things you find that Thaddeus Williams brings up is that much of what is called the black voice is really the liberal white voice. White privilege. We've all heard that term, right? See that African American lady right there on the right by the name of Peggy McIntosh? She's the one that came up with that term. The terms whiteness and white fragility were coined by other liberal white women, usually in the sociological departments or sociology departments of universities. Okay? Let's do our next one. Okay, back in 1970, Patricia Bidal-Padva changed the definition of racism. Okay? I did not know that the definition changed until about a decade ago. Okay? I'm a little slow apparently on some of this stuff. Did you know that it changed? It used to be anyone could be a racist. It didn't matter what the color of your skin was. But she changed the definition to prejudice plus power. So you could be prejudiced no matter what color you are, okay? But if you don't have the power to do anything to the people you're prejudiced against, you're not really a racist. And so now, who's a racist? Well, white people. No one else is a racist. Okay. Well, You can be broke and have no power and still act in a racist fashion towards someone else. You can kill them because they're white. You can steal from them because they're white or because they're Asian. You know, we talk about the Asian hate crimes that are going on right now. I haven't seen every instance of it, but every time there's been video, it hasn't been a white person. And it is horrible. That doesn't mean that there aren't racists against, white racists against Asians. There are. Okay? Too many of them. I love the scene in Do the Right Thing, which, you know, if you don't like profanity or nudity, watch it on TV if it ever shows up, or VidAngel. Okay? But there's this one scene, kind of in the middle of the movie, and it goes to a montage. Spike Lee, who in my opinion is a racist actually, he hates white people. He goes through these groups of people. So it's the white cops, and it's the black guys on the street, it's the Korean store owner down the street, then the Jewish guy, and they're all of them are expressing prejudice, racism against someone else. You know, the cop is complaining about the poor black people, and the black people are complaining about the Koreans because, you know, those Koreans, who are they to come into our neighborhood and own these stores and tell us what to do and all this kind of stuff. And the Korean guy hates the Jewish guy, and it just kind of goes around and around and around. And you can look it up on YouTube if you just want to see that one scene. But that's just reality. Racism is a common sin in the human heart. It is not limited to one group. So, where was I? And so in addition to redefining racism, advocates of social justice B have also redefined tolerance, marriage, ethnicity, bigotry, and discrimination. So here we have Ekemeni Uwan. I'm not sure who he is, but they've got a longer quote from him. When we talk about white identity, we have to talk about what whiteness is. Well, the reality is that whiteness is rooted in plunder, in theft, in slavery, in enslavement of Africans, genocide of Native Americans. It's a power structure. That is what whiteness is. Because we have to understand something. Whiteness is wicked. It is wicked. It's rooted in violence, it's rooted in theft, it's rooted in plunder, it's rooted in power, in privilege. Okay? So, now, he's not saying white. It's hard for us to logically follow this argument. But he identifies these particular sins and injustices with whiteness, so that anyone who practices those things is also white. So that's why when Larry Elder was running for governor of California, he was called the black voice of white supremacy, because he supported the system, right, that kept black people down. So it doesn't matter what color your skin is, if you're for maintaining the current system, you're white. You're viewed as white. So, let me see here. And so it's really interesting. Whiteness is the way of life that is rooted in exploitation. And so we have European painter Paul Gauguin. I don't know how to pronounce his name. He's French. I mispronounce. Probably. Is he a popular painter? Okay. Yeah. I prefer Rembrandt. What kind of stuff? What style does he paint? Is he an impressionist or? Okay. Yeah, I'm not big on the impressionists. I like the realists. Like Rembrandt, although some Van Gogh. He's a bit of an impressionist, but anyway. This guy, Gauguin, he decided that Europe was hopelessly oppressive, that there was no hope for change whatsoever, so he moved away. And because he was following the views of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he was looking for that noble savage, right? Haven't been corrupted by civilization, okay? Right. He went to Polynesia. And when he got to Tahiti, thinking he was going to find paradise, what he found was an island full of alcoholics with sexually transmitted diseases because they were promiscuous. And I'm sure that's probably blamed on the STDs are probably blamed on the white people. But there was all kinds of these broken families, and there were corrupt politicians. Didn't find paradise. What is it? Yeah, I know. They don't have to heat your house. Don't have to buy a car and keep it. Yeah. History is fun. It's not just white people that are bad. All right, let's talk a little more about slavery. It is a pertinent subject. I think I got some stuff in there, but if you look between 1500 and 1800, over 1 million Europeans were enslaved by North African pirates. The North African pirates were Muslims, right? And that was actually the birth of the American Navy, was to deal with the Barnaby pirates, North Africa. Barbary pirates. Well, them too. The Battle of Tripoli. Yep. But they had to have a navy. And so that's when Jefferson got a navy. Because they were tired of the pirates, the Muslim pirates, stealing the ships and the cargo and selling them off. So they did this. So most of these Europeans, because they were Christians, were despised and mistreated by the Muslims. Okay? So when we look at when you basically look at any people group, you will find some practice of enslavement by other members of their group. You will find slavery in every corner of this world. More slaves were kept in Africa by Africans than were sold to the West. And actually, that was happening before the West started buying slaves. And the West started buying slaves because they realized the Arabs, the Muslims, were making so much money on the slave trade. And they said, why don't we get some? Okay? And so the slave trade, the African slave trade, okay, trading out of Africa started with Muslims. Okay? Yeah, and then it was copied by the Europeans. Okay? But lots of them were kept there in Africa, and they did things like working in salt mines. You don't last long in a salt mine. Very oppressive. In the U.S. colonies, or what would become the U.S. colonies, the American colonies, white indentured servants were often sold on auction too. You wanted to come to America, you couldn't afford to come to America, you traded your freedom for a period of indentured servitude to get here, but then, the person you sold yourself to might sell you to someone else, and you would go in the auction block just like an African would. We don't talk about that, do we? India and China have been larger slave traders than the West. No one talks about that. And historically, it's just insane, the amount of slavery in Asia. So And yes, a lot of that is based on race. So, all cultures, all colors have participated greatly in slavery and need to repent. You might say, some people might think, oh, what about the Native Americans? Native Americans had slaves, black slaves, as well as other Indian slaves before white people showed up. Yes, there were. Okay? So, slavery is not a white person thing. It's an every person thing, every group. Nikki's, was it her great-grandmother or a grandmother? I cannot remember. Must be great-grandmother. Yeah. Okay. Was a Choctaw slave in Oklahoma. Listed back in the annals of that. So, it's not simply theoretical. I know somebody whose family tree goes back there. So, any questions on question 8? I kind of feel like it meandered, but I was trying to bring up all of the facts that flesh out the story and change the dynamics of the story. Well, those cultures that participate in it. Well, some of them still are. Yeah, there's still slavery. For instance, there's still slavery. Arabs still go to the sub-Saharan Africa and take black Africans and bring them north to the Arab areas as sex slaves. It still happens. Yeah, it still happens around the world. And those people need to repent. And we do need to recognize, hey, this was bad. But we also need to recognize we weren't the only bad ones. So, social justice A sees injustice and oppression among all people groups, whereas social justice B singles out Europeans and uses whiteness as a mark of evil. So, we're going to pass on because we're taking too much time. So, any other comments or questions before we go to number 9? Because I'm in big trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, you might be.
Well, I meant that in terms of my my lack of progress.
I can think of one reason why racism exists, and I know there has to be more. But it occurs to me that Hitler scared of the unknown.
Yeah.
So that would be a reason for racism.
Yeah. And also there's a fear of loss of status. Okay. When you think about the history of this country, which is not significantly different than other countries. Okay, but whoever was the newest group that came over were hated. Why? Because they were going after, because they don't speak the language and everything else, they were going for the lowest paying jobs. Well, the people who had the lowest paying jobs didn't want to lose the lowest paying jobs. Okay? And that fed, now you begin to not like that people group because they're seen as a threat to your existence. Okay? For instance, I grew up in New England, okay? And one of the people groups we didn't like were the French Canadians. Because the French Canadians, the French Canadians would come down and take the construction jobs. A lot of them worked construction. And so they would come down and they would push out the people who were involved in the construction industry. And so there began to be a lot of resentment against French Canadians. Okay? I come from French Canadians, so shh, don't tell anybody. Yeah. But but our ghettos, the bad part of town in the city I grew up in, it was Puerto Ricans. And so, yeah, there was prejudice against Puerto Ricans as a result of that. They had their time when they were at the bottom of the scale, and yeah, they were. Yeah. Italians for quite some time. The largest mass lynching in American history took place just outside of New Orleans, and it was Italians that were strung up. So, all right, number 9, because I'm not going to finish this thing tonight. Does our vision of social justice distort the best news in history? In other words, does our view mess with the gospel? Does it crowd the gospel out? Does it gut the gospel of its main elements? Those sorts of things. And social justice A keeps the gospel as primary and justice as secondary. Okay? In other words, if you're going to see real change in society, people need to be converted to Jesus. And then they'll start to care about justice. Social justice B does not care about their conversion to Jesus. They care about their conversion to anti-racism or anti-misogyny or anti-capitalism. And if you happen to be a Christian later on, that's okay. We don't care. But the justice is primary, or their understanding of justice. Okay. Thaddeus Williams notes. I don't know if I put that in there. Yeah, I did. Without the gospel first, we become graceless in our truth-telling, cheerless in our giving, and our neighborly love turns into self-righteous showmanship. Okay. See, because you become the guy who points out everything. You're the community policeman. Look, racist. You're not focused on leading people into reconciliation. Your interest is punitive. You're pointing out the racist so that other people will cancel them. You're not identifying the racist so you can come and talk to them and lead them to Jesus and hopefully lead them out of their racism. It's really interesting. I just was listening to a podcast, and it wasn't one of the guys that was being interviewed. They weren't talking so much about this. They were talking about some other stuff. But he's an African-American musician who led probably thousands of people out of the Klan. Because he would just talk with them. He wasn't, look, racist, get him. He would get to know them and allow them to get to know him, and they would begin to realize, this is a human being. He's not trying to harm me. He's actually being kind to me. And they would end up giving him their KKK card and their robes. And they would realize that the lies that they believed. So I don't know if that guy was a Christian, but his approach was certainly not what we find in social justice B. When we think about the heresy in Galatians, I don't know if I put this up here. Yes, I did. In Galatians, we see a couple of different formulations. Jesus plus circumcision equals salvation. Now, that was the heresy. That's not the gospel, right? That's what Paul was arguing against. The other way it was that it was manifesting, this Judaizer heresy was manifesting itself was Jesus plus the ceremonial laws. Yes, you need Jesus, but you also need to keep the ceremonial law. Okay? Heresy. And so social justice B for Christians is very similar. Because in addition to Jesus, you have to be an anti-racist. Or you're not really a Christian. You have to be, engaged in some form of social justice, or you're not considered a Christian. And so social justice B really is an anti-Christian heresy. That's pretty bold. of Thaddeus to say, but I think he's right when we boil it down. Because it convolutes, it guts the gospel of justification by faith and faith alone. So we'll see some of this, so to speak, in one of Steve's favorite shows, The Good Place. Well, there are four main characters who don't realize that they're actually in hell when the show starts. But they go on this crusade to try and find out when they realize that they're actually in hell. And why aren't they in heaven? Heaven is gained by doing the right thing. It's about works righteousness. Okay. But what they find is that less and less people actually get to heaven. And in fact, no one had gotten to heaven, and I can't remember how many years it had been. It had been this number of years. And when they were trying to find out why, it was because of the algorithm that was used, so to speak. In other words, being a good person becomes increasingly difficult in a globalist society where your tomatoes, the tomatoes that you bought at the store, were harvested by exploited immigrants or slaves, and therefore it's a bad thing for you to buy that tomato. It's not a morally neutral thing for you to buy that tomato. And so every time you go to the store and you buy something, you're participating in oppression and speeding up your way to hell. You unwittingly support the polluters. And so Tahani, the lady there in the red dress, she ends up saying, it feels like a game you can't win. Yep. And that's what social justice B is. It's a form of works righteousness, but it's a game that you can't win because you unknowingly participate in the oppression of other people, and sometimes you knowingly participate in the oppression of other people by the clothes you wear that may have been made in China by people who were enslaved. Or you're using batteries that were mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo by kids, exploiting children. See how complicated it all gets? If you're an environmentalist, you don't want to listen to that stuff because then you stop being an environmentalist because you're an it's just, see, it gets very complicated. And it changes. Yep. So, for instance, I grew up watching Barney Miller, and the Japanese character talks about being Oriental, and he uses the word Oriental. Well, now you can't use the word Oriental. That's now a bad word. You didn't get the memo, did you? Okay, it's a bad word. You can't call a person Oriental. You can talk about Oriental rugs, but see, it changes all the time. What you can and can't call people shifts and changes, and if you say it, you're guilty of a microaggression by people who are always looking to be offended. I've been called a cracker. I've been called all kinds of things. I laughed when I was called a cracker. Like, I'm not from the South. Anyway, social justice B, this idea in the good place, okay, is connected to what social justice B calls infinite responsibility. Everything becomes unjust since everything is unequal, and all inequality is defined as injustice. This guy, Connor Barnes, says that infinite responsibility means infinite guilt, a kind of Christianity without salvation. Whoa. What happened there? Isn't that exciting? Yeah. Well, okay. To see power in every interaction is to see sin in every interaction, because almost every interaction involves a disparity of power, right? I mean, I'm committing an injustice right now. I am exercising power over you because I am a pastor and you are not. You don't have the power to do that. Now, if you all get together, you do. All that the activist can offer to absolve herself or himself is Sisyphean, Sisyphus, but a Sisyphean effort until burnout. Edie's summarization is simpler. Everything is problematic. Or nothing is righteous. Life becomes all about imputing guilt to other people based on their race, their politics, their social class, their gender. We no longer stand before God, but we actually stand before one another as an angry mob out for blood. There is no such thing as forgiveness. Really. Social justice is not the gospel. It's not in the gospel. Social justice does flow out of the gospel. It's a result of the gospel, but it is not itself the gospel. They are separate, and the gospel has a necessary logical priority as the source of biblical justice. Because if you are unrighteous, you really won't pursue justice right, and you will perpetrate greater injustice. All right, might be able to do this. Do we have a question or a comment? That was a shorter section or chapter. Question.
I was thinking about King Solomon, his earlier days, when everything seemed to be going well, and he needed 1,500 sheep a day. So to me, I'm thinking, this is taxation, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That everyone seems happy, so it's not extreme amount.
Well, he had a big administration to feed. Yeah.
There is a balance. People, it seemed like people were all happy with their own.
I'm not sure if they were. You had some people who did some forced labor. I think you read that into it. Yeah, but they weren't having a revolt either. But they did when his son rose to power. They decided that was the time to say, enough's enough. And he said, oh, you ain't seen nothing yet, baby. And they said, hasta la vista, Rehoboam. We'll hang out with Jeroboam, who led them into greater sin. But that's a story for another day. Hmm? You're going to go home? You got a headache? Oh. No, you didn't for a little while, or it was better for a little while. Yeah. All right, see you later. Good thing we took different vehicles. So part 4, which is the final part, has to do with truth or tribes thinking, and this is really the root of critical race theory and all of this stuff. And it gets to the idea that every one of us has what's called an epistemology. An epistemology really is a way of thinking, processing and storing information. It's basically our default operating system. If you think of your computer like a brain, your brain like a computer, it's how we process and store. Okay. So false beliefs are produced by corrupted mental systems, and they end up doing great damage to self and others. And so these false beliefs can create additional false beliefs. They further the corruption, okay? But they're started with corruption. And so tribes thinking processes the world as the story of oppressor groups versus oppressed groups. So if you, they often take it as an acronym: theists, racists, Islamophobes, bigots, exploiters, and sexists. So those are the oppressor groups that are usually in view with this. And so it is right that there are, or sorry, I should say correct. It is correct that there is horrible injustice and oppression committed by human beings from all of those people groups. Okay? Some people do bad things in the name of God. There are racists who do bad things. There are Islamophobes who've done bad things. There's also Islamics who've done bad things, but that's ignored. Bigots, exploiters, and there are men who do bad things to women. Okay? The problem is that this is all tribes thinking sees. Tribes thinking sees. That's all they see. They look at you and they see oppressor. Yeah. You're white, you're an oppressor. You're a man, you're a double oppressor. But we're not done yet. You're a Christian, right? That's 3. Okay? Wait a minute. You're retired. You must have made a goodly sum of money at some point in your life because you're not living on dog food in a cardboard box, right? You upper middle class oppressor, you capitalist pig. Okay, he's got at least 4 strikes against him. Okay? That's kind of the way it rolls. I almost fell and hurt myself. But that's all they see. They don't see Mark, a man with different strengths and different weaknesses, various sins, but also various virtues. They just look and see oppressor.
It's easier that way.
It is easier. Don't actually have to engage anybody on anything. So, personal story. We got another one here. Okay. I went to Boston University, which has come up already in this discussion. And, I remember trying to think about, okay, what's a good pre-law degree? Because when I was getting ready to go to college, I was going to be a lawyer, and so I'm trying to think about this. And I like history, but I chose economics. And as I look back now, I go, wow, that was quite fortuitous. Because the main guy in the history department, whom one of my high school friends who went to BU loves, even to this day, he's on Facebook, he's quotes by this guy and everything. Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn wrote The History, The People's History of America, it's called, that undergirds social justice B and tribal thinking. My life could have been incredibly different had I been drinking at the fountain of this guy's junk. Now, I became a Christian in my second year in college, so maybe it wouldn't have mattered, but I would have been really frustrated. I didn't have that same level of frustration in economics, and actually, the economics department I learned in is completely different than the one that AOC apparently learned in because she got her PhD in economics from BU. And no, I could have sworn she was a PhD student at BU. Well, we'll look at that later, unless Matt decides to go crazy with Siri. But he's otherwise occupied right now. So, I could have been indoctrinated in this tribal thinking on a very liberal campus. I was one of the few conservatives on campus, it seemed. The daily paper was run by the conservatives. It's really interesting. But most of the student body hated John Silber, who was the president of BU. So they were all like Eli, I want to say Wallach, it's not Wallach, Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, and all about this guy. They were the big heroes on campus. This is what happens when you don't have a very strong athletic department. Anyway, okay. All right, I could have sworn.
Not in economics. Economics was like for minor or.
Oh. Well, she wasn't paying attention because we did not, when I was there, Keynesian economics was bad. Yep. That's part of why I'm not a Keynesian. Yeah, government intervention actually delayed the inevitable and made it worse, was essentially what I was taught in the economics department at BU. So they were not government interventionists. And I wonder if they were actually following von Mises. But yeah, it would have been interesting. Because I probably would have loved reading von Mises at that point in my life. He's an Austrian economics guy who, his critique of communism is one of the most powerful critiques of communism. So, yep. All right. Does our vision of social justice make one way of seeing something the only way of seeing everything? And so this gets to the idea of tunnel vision. Okay? The scriptures do provide us with a grand story to understand life, the universe, and just about everything. Okay? We were made for stories. There's a reason why we love stories. We watch them on TV, we go to the movies, we go to plays, we read books, we read magazines, we tell them by the fireside. People have been telling stories for millennia. It's who we are, man. And that's because we were made to believe God's story. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. We were made to believe that, okay? But the world produces counterfeits, right? Doesn't want to believe God's story, so we make up these other stories to try and make sense of the universe. And so sometimes it's just theoretical, like philosophy, but sometimes there's a story. And so worldly ideologies provide these counterfeit stories that try to explain everything, okay? And usually they are produced by a just cause. You see a problem, and you basically create a story to explain your problem and to solve your problem, but it's tunnel vision. It doesn't really account for the real problem, okay? It doesn't really deal with sin, in other words, okay? So beware of your just cause. As I've said in sermons before, oppression really happens, but it is not the reason for most things that go wrong in the world. But if you are social justice B, it's the reason for everything that's wrong. You even blame the hurricanes on oppression. If those rich white people wouldn't drive their SUVs, there wouldn't be climate change, and we wouldn't have all of these hurricanes that are destroying these poor people in the Philippines. Sorry, there are typhoons there. There's my white privilege, calling them hurricanes. Okay. So gaps, inequalities, and those things can exist for any number of reasons. Okay? But in tribes thinking, there's only one. When you question the tribalist view, okay, and you try to point out, hey, this could be because of X, Y, and Z, and usually you have facts to back up your story, it doesn't matter. You are simply guilty of siding with the oppressors, okay? That's it. So it becomes what is called an ad hominem attack. And so because of this, tribes thinking ruins meaningful relationships and meaningful thinking. You've got your talking points, that's it. And if the other person disagrees, they're bad. There's no, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Let's talk about this some more. So there's this idea that's called concept creep. And it's like some of this idea, you put dye in a glass of water and it spreads, right? It spreads out, and so soon your whole glass of water will be blue. Well, just think of the dye as a concept. Ideas creep through culture like ink in water. They begin to discolor and infect everything. It doesn't stay isolated in a little hermeneutical place. So, if you avoid data and replace it with tribal thinking, what you end up doing is you shadow box against your ideological projections, not reality. You aren't having a discourse with the real person talking with you. I wouldn't be dialoguing with Susan. okay? I would just be answering what I think Susan is saying based on my presuppositions of what people like Susan would say, okay? Because she's a racist. All right? And she's a Christian. If you avoid the data, what you end up doing is that you don't actually fix anything, and you generally make things worse, okay? And so you see things that aren't there, okay? You see injustice that isn't really there. It is a form of inequality perhaps, but it's not an injustice. But you also miss the injustice that actually is there. People often don't see real oppression that stares them in the face because they're so focused on what they think is oppression. I'm getting there. Yeah, that's a good question. And so one of the students made some claims about Planned Parenthood, about what a great organization they were, and how they provide all these mammograms for these women and all this kind of stuff. And so Thaddeus Williams fact-checked the student's claims and linked data to it. And instead of going, really? The person said, you're just siding with those who oppress women. So your goal is not to save lives. Your goal is to oppress women, and you don't want abortion, and therefore you're making this stuff up about Planned Parenthood. So they're afraid of the oppression of women, but what they don't see, for instance, is that 64% of women say that they were pressured into getting that abortion, or to at least go to the abortion clinic. 77.9% felt guilty for having an abortion. They don't talk about that. Oh no, we get to shout our abortion. We're proud of our abortion. Well, yeah, I guess that there are, 22% of women who are happy they had an abortion, but the vast majority, which they don't talk about, feel guilty. 59% of them felt that part of them died when they had that abortion. 81% experienced mental health issues as a result, probably, of having an abortion. It's hard to actually say it's as a result of, but if you feel guilty and you felt part of you died, you're probably depressed. In the U.S., okay, you want to talk about oppression and injustice? 90% of Down syndrome diagnoses end in abortion. And as many people have discovered, that Down syndrome test is not always accurate. Also in the U.S., we have a disproportionate number of black abortions. Okay? No one talks about abortion as genocide, but maybe they should. It was eugenics. They ignore all that stuff. Margaret Sanger was a racist woman. Similarly, in Asia, widespread sex selection through abortion. That's kind of oppression of women, isn't it? Because they're aborting girls. If we switch it to pornography, because no one gets hurt with pornography, right? Well, it is a $97 billion a year industry. And in 2018, this would be before COVID, I know it went higher during COVID, one site alone, which was probably Pornhub, had 5.5 billion hours of viewing. I think I remember reading the article about that a few years ago, so it was Pornhub. 5.5 billion hours. It's insane. Well, no one gets hurt, right? Child porn is one of the fastest growing online businesses. I think those children get hurt. It's linked to human trafficking, rape, domestic violence, broken relationships, depression, drug use, and the list goes on. It is not a victimless crime, no matter what some people might want to say. Social justice B also ignores Christian persecution. It also turns a blind eye to the victims of communism and socialism, even though they number in the hundreds of millions. They're not important. We're not going to talk about that. They missed the main thing as well. Not only that, but nearly half of millennial Christians who have been infected with this think that evangelism is wrong. Getting someone to change their beliefs is a version of oppression. Okay. So.
Who thinks that?
Some Christians who have been, people who profess to be Christians who have been influenced by social justice B. Yeah. Yeah, man. Those missionaries just make people's lives miserable. All right, 11. We're almost done. Does the vision of social justice turn the lived experience of hurting people into more pain? This is a question of suffering. What happens with suffering? Okay? Are you addressing the suffering, or are you perpetuating the suffering? Like dragging it out forever and ever over that one event. And so within social justice B, the focus is on the lived experience, or what is called standpoint epistemology. This means that one's experiences of oppression are unquestionable and authoritative. Always believe the women. Okay? Or whatever it might be. Always believe the oppressed. Okay? And it has a sense of authority. We must act on what this person says. These experiences are then used to justify and shape changes in policy, curriculum, and theology. Because, let's look at Florida. Because a sexual minority was rejected by their parents, therefore we should perpetuate this problem, or not that problem, but we should indoctrinate all of these children and all of the sexual minority stuff and the different pronouns that they should use, and we won't tell their parents if they come out to us, and all of this stuff that were in that video. If you question the lived experience, you are an oppressor. So once again, I'm an oppressor. Well, I've been called a racist, and I'm also an oppressor. So, on the positive side, okay, we should listen. Lived experiences do matter. If you have been harmed by another human being, that matters. Okay? If you've been robbed, you've been raped, it matters. Your story matters. It does. But lived experiences are not all that matters. But we should be quick to listen. But what we don't want people to do is globalize those experiences. Okay? Let's pretend I was robbed by a blonde-haired man with a beard. I now, because I globalize it, think that I will be robbed by every blonde-haired man with a beard. I will begin to act against the interests of the blonde-haired men with beards that I encounter. If I see him walking down a staircase at a mall, I might trip him. Or I might say, thief! Because obviously all blonde-haired men with beards are thieves. That's the idea of globalization. Okay? Everyone who fits that description is bad. That's globalization. Well, we want to remind people that globalization is wrong. Not everyone who has blonde hair and a beard is a thief. When we listen, we can positively help them bear their burdens. Okay? We can identify, hey, what happened to you was really horrible. But that doesn't mean that everyone who has blonde hair and a beard is evil and out to get you. But what this lived experience thing does, next one, is that it begins to rewire brains for breakdown, okay? Because of the fear reflex. We talked about this, the flooding that takes place, your rational capabilities shut down when you experience fear, okay? But what happens is that when people generalize the lived experiences, it generalizes the trauma so that you begin to view the world or a particular group of people as dangerous. And so we need to begin to help people degeneralize and stop globalizing. And that takes a lot of patience. Right? Tribal thinking specializes in generalizing this lived experience. All people like that person will hurt you. And so confirmation bias happens when we begin to select additional examples to prove your generalization. Okay? In other words, every comment somehow becomes this dog whistle for your boogeyman group. Okay? In other words, if I have been robbed by the blonde man with a beard, and I meet another blonde-haired man with a beard who snaps at me because he had a bad day and I stepped on his toe, that just confirms my bias against blonde-haired people with beards. See, told you they were bad. And so you find every example of a person who has blonde hair and a beard as bad, as confirming your bias against those people, but you never use the kind person with the blonde hair and beard to challenge your prejudice against the blonde-haired person with a beard. So the dog whistle thing, I mean, I'm sitting there on my elliptical thing, working. There's an unnamed news station, and they were talking about the Supreme Court questions. And they actually used, these are dog whistles for the QAnon people. To alert the QAnons about how bad this nominee is. I'm like, who even cares about QAnon? I mean, some people do. I don't know if I've actually met a QAnon person. I probably have, but I don't know. I don't spend my life worrying about the QAnon people. Even the dude who was arrested, the shaman guy, he's just nuts. Even though he's from Arizona. Well, you know, yeah, you can be smart and crazy. He's got some issues. But if we never question our shared experience, we'll see oppression everywhere. I skipped that one, but every comment kind of becomes a microaggression. You're looking to be insulted. Everything becomes an insult. When, sometimes someone's just joking with you in a good-natured way. But I won't talk about the slap. It's too tempting. And so there's a difference between hurtful experience and helpful evidence. And this gets into that whole idea of people, a lot of people are worried about being on the wrong side of history. But how do you know you're going to be on the wrong side of history until you get all the facts? What you are right now is on the wrong side of the current narrative, perhaps? Well, if we get to the slap, I mean, it's interesting. Half the country blames Chris Rock and half the country blames Will Smith. So it's really interesting. Who knows who's wrong, right? But the history is really the present, and it is based on limited information of the present as well. In other words, they don't have all the facts. And so one of the things that I keep going back to, because it was very high profile, is this. There it is. The Duke lacrosse team. We were sold a bill of goods that they all raped this girl, and it turned out that that was not true. That they found an ambitious prosecutor who turned things all different kinds of ways. But you know what? Their lives were still ruined. It's not simply that they didn't get to finish their season, this kind of thing. Some of these guys, I mean, they walk around with like this giant R on their chest. They're suspect. You're one of them, aren't you? They thought their lives had such great promise, and because someone lied about them, their lives are ruined. There was another case, an African-American high school student, football player, had a big scholarship to a nice university to play football. He got accused of rape, got sent to prison. I think it was 10 years later, something like that. The woman finally came forward and said, "I lied." This guy lost his education, all that stuff. 10 years-ish of his life because someone lied. But everyone was convinced he was right. Rolling Stone had this article about the rape culture at the was it University of Virginia in Charlottesville? It was all lies. But you so want to be on the right side of history that people jump to conclusions, and that's why I usually don't comment on a lot of current events unless, kind of wait and see what actually happens. Because sometimes, hands up, don't shoot, didn't happen. So. Right. Didn't happen. But because you don't want to be seen as a bad guy, you jump to the conclusion about this person. We should worry about being on the wrong side of truth when it all gets said and done. Okay? Feelings and facts are different. Lived experience is not the same thing as objective reality. It's a lot about feelings. Sadly, critical thinking has been called one of the defining marks of white supremacy by some. Similar to if you, I don't know if you can still find the Black Lives Matter website. Okay. This is the group. Okay. So they say they're Marxists and they're right. And when you went on their website, what you found was they wanted to get rid of the nuclear family. They wanted to get rid of heteronormativity, and all various things that they called basically as marks of white supremacy. Not wisdom. They're bad. We want to get rid of them. Okay? Destroying the family, destroying marriage, all of these things. It was not about let's end injustice against African Americans. It was about all this other stuff. And as it turns out, most of the leaders have disappeared, and so has the money. So a lot of it's in Canada now. So, where was I? Jonathan Haidt talks about how he's a moral philosopher who used to be at the University of Virginia, Charlottesville. He's in Boston now, I think. Anyway, truth U exists for the pursuit of knowledge. Social justice U exists to change the world by overthrowing power structures and privilege. Kind of, which do you think will be have more success actually addressing injustice? So, all right, I have one more, but I'm not going to do it. Not going to do it. It is 9:10, almost 9:10. If you want to go, except for Matt, you're free to go. If you have comments or questions, things you want to kind of play out a little bit, I am willing to do that. But if Matt really needs to go, then maybe I shouldn't be willing to do that. I don't want to oppress him. Yeah. Well, I mean, you are blonde-haired and bearded, so I can't oppress you because.
I thought I was gonna get tricked on the way out the door.
Well, you're not blonde anymore. Now you're white-haired. Any thoughts or questions before we wrap up? I know this is
Sure how this really relates to us. We see all that out there, and there's these people doing all this, but what about us? And when we do see a true injustice, or a true immorality, or a true unbiblical thing that's being taught or in the school, what do we do about that?
okay.
We
Well,
just sit back and not do anything? Do we
no.
get actively involved? Do we get to be social activists and try to fight an immorality or unjust treatment of children in the schools? Or, I mean, so all this seems kind of like out there. This whole big picture of racism and blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. But what do we do? How do we
Yeah.
deal with things when we see that are morally wrong?
Yep.
What do you do?
Well,
Individually?
Well, individually and in groups. I mean, groups are fine, but you address the specific injustice. You can do that. You can write letters. You can protest, vote.
Earlier you said protests are bad, writing's bad.
Well, no,
Now you're saying it's okay to protest.
it's okay to peacefully protest. Not rioting.
But you said writing was bad, protest was bad.
Well, I said rioting is bad. Well, if you're protesting a lie, well, I mean, if you are protesting on behalf of a lie, that's the problem. But if you're protesting against a lie, I see that as a good thing. Yeah. No, we don't have to hide in a rock up in Push Ridge or something. We can begin to address them, we can begin to talk about them, but we want to make sure that we have the right information, that we are accounting for what may or may not be at play here, as opposed to jumping into conclusions and doing a similar game, because conservatives can play a similar sort of game as the social justice B plays. So we want to be making sure that this is an actual injustice. And then we can raise this publicly. This is a problem. And
I've kind of talked about this before, but we talk about Black Lives Matter, and they're on their website, they say they're Marxist, and they want to keep family, and they're, well, that's exactly what's on the Democratic platform, is the word. That it's okay to be associated with that group, even though their statement of what they believe is totally anti-biblical. All the same things that BLM says, that's what the Democratic platform says.
no, but that's why I try to tell people, look at the platforms.
Okay.
And do you agree with them? And what don't you agree with? And how important do you think that is? And but I try to point people to original sources as much as I can. So, I would link to, and I've done this, I linked to the Black Lives Matter website with their page that had those things. I'm not making this stuff up, and that's why I don't like memes. The memes are for fun. Memes are not for communication of truth. They can if they include a citation. If they provide rationale for it, but that's why I say go look at the platform of candidates. What are they saying they want to do? I mean, what the current president is doing is not a surprise to me, because yes, I paid attention, but apparently a lot of people didn't, because they're going, what in the what? I don't understand this. You weren't listening. You were so angry at the mad tweeter that you didn't realize what this guy said he was going to do. He didn't hide it. He was pretty open about it. And you know what? We got what we voted for.
We got what they voted.
Well, yeah, we as a country got what we voted for. I didn't vote for him, but I got him.
So he's not, I wouldn't consider him a legitimate president, because he was put in place through fraud, and it's still fraudulent, and he's not a legitimate
Yeah, he's making the decisions, or someone's making the decisions under his. But either way, but I mean, that's really the thing. I mean, you can point people, say, why are you surprised? He told you this. Why don't we go find the Democratic platform for 2020 and look at it? You'll find it's all there. Don't be surprised. Don't be disappointed. This is what happens when you vote for that. This is the consequence. You've got it. So it didn't turn out the way you hoped. You kind of thought it would be different, but, and it's a little different when, like Obama's first campaign, he, I think, affirmed traditional marriage. And then he changed his mind after he got into office and began to push that. So, that would be a sort of a whoops. But, see, I never read his books. I don't know if that's one of the things that's in his books, but a lot of the things he ended up trying to do were in his books. So, trying to educate people. Not the name calling, not resorting to the same tactics. Well, you're just saying that because you're a communist. Well, maybe, but that's not going to actually help someone's mind change. And this gets back to a lot of that stuff that we talked about with Jonathan Haidt, trying to find the moral value that they have and begin to address that and see that you have similar concerns about the poor. Looking at everything that we were doing for COVID made no sense to me, economically too. And I knew that inflation was going to come. Okay? Try to tell people that, they don't want to hear it. But, here it is. It's not about Putin. It started before Putin. Putin's just going to make it worse. Okay? The war in Ukraine is just going to make it worse. But there are things that our government is doing right now that worsen poverty. Okay, you can blame Trump for a lot of stuff, but more African Americans were employed and had good jobs and everything, and things were going really well for them economically. And now all of that, in large part, has been erased thanks to inflation, which is produced by the endless printing of money, as well as unbridled immigration. I have nothing against immigration. Hello. I have nothing against immigration. But I want legal immigration. Okay? And legal immigration usually you put caps on it because your system can only survive so much addition. You need time to provide housing, for instance. What happens if you don't have enough housing? What happens to prices of housing? No one seems to understand this. I don't know why people don't understand any of this stuff. To me, it's simple economics. It is supply and demand. But apparently no one takes economics anymore. So they think you can increase the demand on something significantly without increasing the price, particularly in a time when there is limited supply because of world events that are going on. Don't blame the oil companies. I remember it was popular to do that under Obama. But when you looked at what their return on investment was, their profit margin is not very high. And so because they sell so much, it's a big number. But it's not a profitable business when you think about it in terms of what's your return on investment, their return on assets. So they should make basic economics mandatory so people can understand all this stuff but our politicians can't understand diddly of it because they're all lawyers. Not all. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, you got them because they bought chips and Slurpees and all that kind of stuff. It's the same thing with movie. Yeah, well, that's, McDonald's doesn't make money on burgers. McDonald's makes it on fries and Cokes and those Apple things. Okay. Movie theaters. Yeah, it's popcorn, drinks, and snacks. They get nothing from the movie. The studios get the money from the movie. Okay, but they get the money from the concessions. That's how they make their living. So I'm surprised any of them survived, especially with AMC, because AMC had a lot of debt. I don't know how they made it through COVID. Yeah. Yeah, well, I get my popcorn perks at Harkins, so they don't make that much money off of me in my value cup, or no, not value cup, my whatever they call it. So anyway, I don't spend a tremendous amount of money. Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure.
Well, the fact that we're dealing with a society that's pretty much, our mind is made up of these facts. They don't want to know the facts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this, how can you argue that concept?
Well, they were told it was nothing by the people who were in the know. Well, conservatives lie. Don't you understand?
So if you want to have
I said conservatives lie. I mean, that's the response.
a reasoned discussion between adults over issues
Mm-hmm.
that could have benefits on both sides, or points on both sides, but one side won't listen, or sides won't listen.
Yeah.
And then when you go to the polls, you say, okay, well, we can just vote these, they're going to bring it all the time. You got to vote these rascals out, What did you hear about the war for? I mean, I just heard about a study done by this John Locke, who was famous for doing gun control studies.
Mm-hmm.
And he investigated the voter turnout and ballots cast in various precincts that were in different counties, but on either side of the line, and found that the numbers like 200, between 250 and 300 some thousand fraudulent ballots, invalid ballots were cast in an election in a swing state. I'm thinking, and then right, and then somebody calls up and says,
Yeah, Wisconsin, they've big problems.
there's going to be an election soon to either continue or not continue a half percent sales tax in the city of Tucson. And got a thing in the mail the other day that says this is going to be an all mail-in election. Last summer, or last fall,
That might be ruled illegal now.
well, the city council election was all mail.
Yeah.
And the final election was all mail.
Yeah.
So what do you do? I mean, it said right in there, all eligible voters will be sent a ballot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the law that was just signed, I'm not sure what the effect will be, but you're supposed to provide, this is the weird part of it, I don't know enough. Do I have to go back and provide proof of citizenship to maintain my voting registration? Even though I've got the real ID? So I need the real ID to fly, and I'll need this other thing to vote? I know.
The real ID should count though, because that does have supposedly.
Yeah, that was part of the whole point of the real ID.
Not just the driver's.
And that may work, that may be the new ID that they will.
Yeah. But don't worry, that might be called racist because it's more expensive than a normal driver's license.
Racist to think that they can't get an ID or they can't get
Yeah.
a thing to.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, like in Georgia, the law that they passed made provision for free IDs for people. So unless you have no friends that can give you a ride somewhere to get your free ID, I don't understand. It's not racist.
That's the racist, that's the most racist thing, to think that blacks can't
Oh, I know.
figure out how to use a computer, or how to go to the library and use a computer, or how to get themselves on a bus to get to it. I mean, that is
Yeah,
racist.
it's quite racist. Yeah. So,
Anyway.
but yeah, I mean, you can, when you engage people trying, good night, not to get sucked into the ad hominem thing, but try and bring facts to the table and challenge the ad hominem. It's like, okay, you realize that's a logical fallacy, right? You know, you can't just discredit me because I'm a particular type of person. Don't you understand that that itself would be prejudicial? Yeah, well, sometimes you got to walk them through this stuff, and that doesn't mean you're going to win even 10% of these discussions. But, you know.
Well, we've been on for so long, got so much stuff that I don't believe anything's come out about the Ukraine and Russia.
It is hard to know what is true and what is false.
They
Yeah.
give examples of using video games for their backdrops on the,
Mhm.
presenting, this building's blown up, this building's blown up, was Maternity Hospital blown up, wasn't it? It was empty, it was empty and was being used by the, it's just the lies, and this guy, this poor reporter died, I know he died 6 years ago in this conflict, the very same guy. I mean, the stuff that's coming out is just.
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah, that one is a hoax that they've talked about. It's hard to know what to believe, yeah. Are we still on? Oh, why don't we turn it off? Bye.